This detective, James McLaughlin was his name. McLaughlin, I believe, is a very dangerous man. He's a crusader, and I think his target was never me. It was the Catholic Church. There's a whole church out there ready and willing and able to hear that there's another side of this story. They're just waiting for someone to tell it. It's bizarre, of course. At the time I was accused, I was admissions director for the Servants of the Paraclete Center in Hampshire Springs, New Mexico. It was 92, 93, that it really became nightmarish for the Servants of the Paraclete. I'll never forget the day. It was May 3rd, 1993, and I had been at a meeting with some of our staff, and we got into a big argument because we had an increasing number of priests coming to the Paraclete Center accused of sexual misconduct. More often than not, the accusations were 20 or 30 years old at the time they were brought, but some were current. As the admissions director, I took a position that we must not simply preclude the guilt of each one of these men simply because they were accused. On that same day I left that meeting, I drove home. I shared an apartment with another priest. There was a knock on the door. About 6 that evening. There was 2 police officers from Rio Rancho, New Mexico. I opened the door and they asked if my name was Father MacRae, and I said yes. They asked if I had a driver's license. I gave it to them, and they said, "You're under arrest for charged with 2 indictments." This was 1993, alleged to have occurred between 1979 and 1983. 2 indictments, which they showed me, contained only initials. So I had no idea who was accusing me. There were no details. The indictment simply listed felonious sexual assault. And the initials on the indictments were JG and TG. I had no clue who this was. I was taken immediately to a county jail, and I was entitled to a bond hearing within 24 hours. I was released on personal recognizance bail the next day in New Mexico. But then I learned that the detective in New Hampshire who choreographed this case, as opposed to investigating it, personally faxed 40 pages to a New Mexico newspaper. And the headline that night, around May 17th or so, was "Paraclete Official Indicted for Rape." And that was the end of my employment. It was the end of my ministry. It was the end of my career with them. I started to fight the case. It was months before I even knew who was accusing me. I started to obtain discovery, and then learned who the accusers were. And there was something from day one that was very disturbing about the discovery. All defendants and their counsel are entitled to see everything that the state uses against them. But the discovery in this case consisted of no investigation whatsoever. Simply the police reports of this one detective's interviews with each of these brothers. They turned out to be 3 adult brothers. In the end, there were 4 from the same family who accused me. So we had nothing to go on but these police reports. And they came forward separately over the course of several weeks. We never knew even how they came to be in Detective McLaughlin's office. It was never clear to us whether they had gone to him with a complaint, whether he had gone to them. There was some evidence from others that that was the case. We knew that they went to personal injury lawyers, but there was a conflict throughout all of the investigation and even the trial. We never got an answer on who they went to first. At trial, the accuser said that he went to Detective McLaughlin, who referred him to a contingency lawyer. Detective McLaughlin testified that the accuser went to a contingency lawyer who referred him to McLaughlin. We never got to the bottom of this. In the reports, however, the first of the three brothers to come forward, Jonathan Grover, accused me and another priest of both simultaneous and separate abuses of him. He claimed that these abuses occurred when he was 10 years old. I wasn't ordained a priest until he was 14. And the other priest he was accusing of acting simultaneous with me was not present in that community until he was 16. As time went on, we were able to determine that. But throughout this investigation, no one had obtained my personnel file. No one had sought to corroborate these dates. No one had done anything. Simply, we have an interview, now we have an indictment. And so my attorney from 2,000 miles away was saddled with having to investigate and ran up against roadblocks every step of the way. My diocese would not cooperate with the investigation. Priests of the diocese who were with me in those places at those times would not answer requests for information, even the most simple things. One priest we wrote to replaced me in a parish, and our only question of him was, can you corroborate that these three offices in this rectory are where this diagram says they are? And he wrote back and said, I will not help you and do not see the need for any communication with you. It was mind-boggling. So we were on our own, and that was made very clear. We were able to show that the other priest accused was not present in this community until Jonathan Grover was 16, and here he is accusing us of raping him at the age of 10, and that I was not there until 14. At about the same time we were able to demonstrate that, Jonathan Grover disappears into the background and another brother comes forward with a whole new set of claims and a whole new set of dates and times and places. The second brother was David Grover, was then about 28, said that he was driving his car. Again, he appears in Detective McLaughlin's office. No idea how, no knowledge of how he got there or why. He claimed that he was driving his car and heard a radio announcement about the Diocese of Fall River agreeing to a mediated settlement in 80 lawsuits against the diocese. And he said that he pulled over and began to weep because this flood of memories of his own abuse came into play. He claimed that at the age of 12, I raped him in St. Bernard's Rectory in Keene, New Hampshire. And again, this was thrown out there in a police report with no attempt to corroborate anything. I arrived at St. Bernard's Rectory in Keene, New Hampshire, and it was demonstrable on June 15, 1983, 2 weeks before David Grover's 18th birthday. So I could not have been there when he was 12 years old. He told this whole story of being repeatedly raped between the ages of 12 and 14 in the St. Bernard Rectory while visiting me, overnight stays, all of this. And then 2 months went by, and he appeared in the detective's office again, this time with a whole different story. His new story was that in 1982, I had brought him to another parish where he was raped by 2 other priests who he could not identify. He could not name them. One of the 2 priests there at the time was the same priest that the other brother had been accusing. However, this gets really convoluted. David Grover claimed in this police report that he went there to this rectory with me because we had a positive relationship and he had no reason to suspect anything had been wrong, could be wrong. 2 months earlier, he told the same detective that over the previous 4 years, I had raped him repeatedly in the other rectory. This was making no sense, and there was just no questioning at all. It was simply a narrative repeated by the detective with no sense of any prompting, of any questioning, nothing whatsoever. And then at some point, this detective or the accusers or their contingency lawyers became aware of these time parameter conflicts. And so there's a new police report with all of them, and the detective gave them a copy of my resume so they could actually accuse me at a time that I was there. And then there was a whole new set of interviews and a whole new set of accusations and dates, as if none of the other interviews had ever taken place. Then a third brother came forward, completely excluding all the information of the other two. He claimed that when he was 15 years old, which would have been the summer of 1983, in the weeks just after I arrived at this parish, he claimed that he came to see me for counseling for his drug dependency. He claimed that he was forcibly raped at each counseling session in my rectory office, and that each week he returned for counseling, unable to remember that he was raped the week before. There was no consultation with an expert to see if this was even possible. This, again, was just thrown out there. We have this claim, now we have an indictment. And then that was the case that went to trial. From day one, I maintain and still do that neither the counseling sessions nor the sexual assaults ever took place. This was a young man who, at 15, 16, was 5'11", 180, 190 pounds. And the claim was that I had shut the door, tackled him, raped him, let him go, and then he came back for his next appointment a week later. This made no sense whatsoever. Then the plea deal offers began. I was offered originally a sentence of 7.5 to 15 years if I would plead guilty to one of these claims and dismiss the rest. I refused it. A few months went by, and then the offer changed to 3.5 to 7 years, and I refused that. And then a few months after that, there was another offer, and it was the state's last best effort, the prosecutor's last best effort. He put in writing to my attorney that I could serve a sentence of 1 to 3 years if I would agree to plead guilty to one charge. And this really created a dilemma for those who were defending me, because the lawyers at least knew the risk that we were taking by not taking a plea deal. So my attorney sat me down and told me that innocent defendants plead guilty all the time to control a sentence, but I just couldn't do it. In fact, during the trial, during testimony at the trial, as Thomas Grover was describing out-of-body experiences and these counseling sessions, which never took place, we had a break in the trial, and at the end of his testimony, the prosecutor repeated his offer and changed it. It would be 1 to 2 years in prison if I would stop the trial at that point and plead guilty, because it seemed clear to me that he himself did not believe what was being said up on the stand. My lawyer discussed this deal, this offer with me. I told him I didn't feel I could do it, and he asked me to take 10 minutes and think about it. So I went to a telephone in the lobby during the trial, and I called an attorney for my diocese, and I told him about the offer that had just been presented to me. I asked him what would be the repercussions for the diocese in the event that I took such a deal. I told him that I was leaning so heavily against it, and he said it would make it more difficult for us to defend against the lawsuits. Then I called a friend who was a canon lawyer, and I asked him what would be the canonical repercussions, and he said you would be dismissed from the priesthood. So I walked back into the courtroom and refused the deal. When I refused the deal, the court became very irritated with me because I said that this deal would be a negotiated lie, and I'm not participating. In the end, it turned out over time that my diocese did nothing to defend against the lawsuits. I did not even know that even before trial, settlement negotiations were already underway. Before jury selection in my trial, while knowing that that I maintained my innocence of the charges and knowing that we were fighting to put together a defense, I received a phone call one day from an Albuquerque Journal reporter who asked me what my feelings were about the press release that had just been issued from my diocese. I had no idea there was a press release. I had not seen it. And he read it to me over the telephone. Nothing in this whole process left me devastated as much as this press release. And we never understood what prompted it. But months before jury selection was scheduled in my trial, my diocese issued a statement saying, "The Catholic Church has been a victim of the actions of Gordon MacRae, just as these individuals accusing him have been. The Church mourns with these victims. It is clear that he will never again function as a priest." And here I am about to enter into jury selection in a trial, and this press release hits headlines throughout New Hampshire and then in New Mexico. And we were devastated. My defense attorney was completely demoralized. My attorney said that my civil rights to a presumption of innocence and a fair trial had just been terminated. At a point in the trial, as the accuser was testifying about his claim that his testimony was actually very simple. This enormous man sat on the stand and said that when he was 15, he was in my office for counseling for his drug dependency. He said that that I shut the door, locked it. Nobody ever went to look to see if those doors had locks. They did not. And then walked across the room and unzipped his fly and forced him to undergo oral sex. He said that when I finished, I simply went back to my seat and we continued the counseling. And that this happened 5 weeks in a row, 5 consecutive sessions. And obviously there was going to be some cross-examination here. I was sitting here, my attorney was sitting here, the center aisle was right here. My attorney stood up to question Thomas Grover. Immediately Thomas protested. He put up his hands and turned to the judge, Judge Arthur Brennan. And he said to the judge, "I can't answer his questions." And the judge said, "Why not?" And Thomas said, "Well, because he's standing too close to him," meaning me, "and I don't want to have to look at him. I can't bear it. I can't bear to look at him during this trial." This was not a 12-year-old. This was a 27-year-old man. And so the judge ordered my attorney to walk as far in the courtroom as he could physically go and to conduct his cross-examination from way over here. And so he did. And Thomas just, when he was asked to explain why he came back from week to week after being raped, as he described in my office, he said, "I don't know how I got there, I repressed it." So my attorney pushed him and said, "Can you explain this repression?" He said, "I had out-of-body experiences." So my attorney asked him to explain it. The man paused and then suddenly started sobbing uncontrollably. The judge ordered a break in the trial. During this break, a woman approached my attorney and she said, "There's a problem here." And my attorney said, "Well, who are you and what is it?" She introduced herself. She said, "I've been sitting here watching this, and there's a woman here in the courtroom who is influencing his testimony." She said, at the time that you asked the question to explain his out-of-body experiences, I saw him staring at her, and so I looked like this to see her, and she went like this. And then he began sobbing on the stand. The observer who saw this said that the issue was not that you were standing next to MacRae, the issue was that you were blocking his view of her. So my attorney asked for a break in the trial, and the judge declared another recess. My attorney walked up to this woman and asked her name. She said her name is Pauline Goupil, and she introduced herself as a therapist hired by Thomas Grover's contingency lawyer to counsel him throughout the trial. The observer who saw this behavior said that the woman had actually done that, the signal to cry twice. The other question that prompted it was, who did you go to first, a lawyer or the police? And Thomas began sobbing on the stand again, but this woman had given the same signal to cry. The judge also refused to allow the defense to bring before the jury Thomas Grover's criminal record, which included charges of fraud, forgery, burglary, assault, all sorts of false pretense charges. And the judge ordered that those offenses were from his juvenile record and from too long ago to be pertinent to the trial, but they were from the same time period as the claims. The judge told me that if I take the stand in my own defense, he is going to open the door to allow the unrelated, what he called unrelated charges of the other accusers to be entered into evidence. And they will simply serve to corroborate Thomas Grover's story. And so my lawyer told me, you can't take the stand in your own defense. So we ended up with no defense at all. In the end, the judge instructed the jury that under New Hampshire law, in a case where there is no physical evidence like this one, the jury must determine whether it believes the story of the accuser over the story of the defendant. Actually, the judge called the accuser the victim. He said to the jury, you must conclude whether or not you believe the story of the victim over the story of the defendant. The defendant told no story. He did not take the stand, but you have to determine who you believe. And they came back in less than 2 hours with a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Brennan sentenced me to 30 times the state's proffered plea deal, 33.5 to 67 years. In the New Hampshire system, at least, a defendant is eligible for the lower sentence only if he publicly admits to guilt of the crime. And so that has been the dilemma. I would have left prison 15 years ago had I taken the deal the state offered to me. I do not regret not taking that deal. After the trial was over, the state, my lawyer resigned from the case. He just felt he could not defend against this case any further. There was no investigation. We needed a private investigator. There was none of that. So he left the case and went back to New Mexico. I was left in the hands of a public defender, and the state was offering a deal for the remaining charges involving the other two brothers and another person who had come forward during the course of the trial, also alleging 20-year-old behavior. The state offered a deal of 1 to 2 years, concurrent with whatever I'm going to be sentenced to, so it was no time whatsoever. I never thought I could be in this kind of position, but I'm in a county jail awaiting sentencing. Everyone has abandoned the case. I'm in contact with no one. And then the state comes forward and tells me that I must take this deal. I got called to the jail director's office, and he had a call from my attorney in New Mexico, who let me put me on the phone, let me talk to him, and he told me, "You have no choice. We have some good appellate issues. We might win an appeal in this trial. You will never survive 2 more trials. You will never survive 2 more appeals. You have no resources. You have no assets. You have no choice." So I stood up in court 2 weeks later with another attorney's hand on my back, pushing me. And the judge said, "How do you plead in these remaining charges?" And I couldn't answer. Judge Brennan asked it a second time. The attorney poked me in the back, and I said guilty. And then sat down. I just couldn't believe this was happening. And I walked out of that. I was taken right from there to state prison. And a friend of mine who was in the court was outside as I was on the set-up perp walk for the media between the courtroom and the prison-bound man with chains and handcuffs. And I turned to him and I said, "That was another negotiated lie." And he said, "I know it was." That's where it stood. I spent my first 6 years in prison in a cell with 7 other inmates, sharing a cell the size of this room. But because I maintained my innocence and became program ineligible in the prison system, I spent longer than any other New Hampshire inmate in an 8-man cell, 6 years, as opposed to 6 months. Finally, after 6 years, I was moved. I requested a move. I requested it 2 or 3 times a year, and it was always denied. And then finally, it was granted, and I was moved to a cell, to a unit where there are 2 per cell. They're terribly small, but they're built for 1, but they're 2. And I was there until the Wall Street Journal wrote about my case, and then suddenly, a few weeks later, I was moved back to the 8-man cells again. It was horrific. After 2002, what prompted me to go to the Wall Street Journal to Dorothy Rabinowitz, was that during the big settlement, during the big crisis that occurred in 2002, I was accused by 2 people I have never met, who simply saw my name online in the released files and decided that they were going to accuse me. There's another priest in here. He has confided in me that he is guilty. It's not confided, it's public knowledge. He was in the infirmary one day, and shortly after I was accused by 2 people I've never met in 2002, he told me that he was accused by 2 people he has never met. And the same attorney brought each of these claims. So then I did a little research, and I found out that this attorney, Peter Hutchins is his name, in 2002 brought 64 lawsuits. They weren't even lawsuits. They weren't even filed in a court of law. He simply had 64 accusers against 28 priests, all of whom were listed on the diocesan website, and wanted a settlement. And the diocese wrote him a check for $5.5 million. The attorney actually told us the newspapers were covering that settlement. Attorney Hutchins is quoted in both the Nashua Telegraph and the Manchester Union Leader as saying, "The diocese didn't even ask for details like names and dates and places, no corroboration whatsoever." A year later, he had another 60 clients, and a year after that, another 60. And he has come forward almost annually since then, with each year with people held in moderation until he obtains one mediated settlement to be followed by another, all of which ends up with a 40% contingency fee. It was then that I decided that I'm a sitting duck. One of the accusers in my case has recanted, and he told, being called to a meeting, offered an enormous amount of money if he would join my accusers and corroborating their accusations against me. He refused, and he was actually told by somebody who's pretty high profile in this case, think of your wife, I know you're broke, I know you've got a history, I know you're a drug addict, this money could mean a lot. And so he said I was left believing that all I had to do was say what they were saying, and I would get a check. I would have to do nothing else. He claimed that he agreed to this at the meeting. He was given an amount of cash and a promise that he would obtain an enormous amount of money in a claim against the diocese. He agreed to it, was given a subpoena to testify in front of a grand jury for a new indictment. On the morning of the testimony before the grand jury, he showed up at the prosecutor's office and told a secretary, I've been up all night, I know what's going on here, this man did nothing but help me and I'm not going to be part of this. So now I'm left to wonder who else got such a deal and who else was approached. The mother of the three Grover brothers, the accusers, was a sex abuse investigator for Child Protective Services in New Hampshire. And as such, she was aware of elements of other cases involving other priests that had been settled quietly over the years. She was a social worker investigating some of these cases for the state. When her sons accused me, all of the accusations contained elements of these stories involving other priests, and no one investigated them. There was an incident involving her family. It's actually at the time I first met her family. I was driving through her town. I was actually stationed, I spent a summer internship in a neighboring community. I was driving through her town. It was a little town called Marlborough, just outside of Keene, New Hampshire. One of her sons was in the street flagging down a car, and I was the car. I pulled over and I asked him what was wrong. He said his little brother drowned in their pool, and he can't get help. So I pulled into the side street, I pulled into the driveway. I went to their backyard with him, and there were 3 or 4 of her teenage kids there. And they had a 6-year-old boy, a little African-American boy. These were African-American and Native American adopted kids. He was on the ground and pale, and the next door neighbor was a nurse, and she was trying to revive him. And I asked her how long she had been trying, and she said a couple of minutes, and she was very frightened that she had lost him. And she had the boy on his back, and she was trying to give him mouth to mouth, but she was getting no air in him, and I realized that his abdomen was distended. So I grabbed him and turned him over and squeezed, and the water came gushing out of his mouth and lungs. And then I smacked him in the buttocks, and he started to cry, and it cleared his lungs. It wasn't a hard smack, but it saved his life. And the nurse said, "This is about the most incredible thing I've ever seen." She said, I never even thought of that. It's done in childbirth to clear the lungs. And he started coughing and choking, and this town had a volunteer ambulance crew. And I stayed there with him until it took 90 minutes to get the ambulance there. Got him to the hospital, and the doctors told his mother that I had saved his life by this. And she thanked me, and we became friends. She presented in court that I used this incident to infiltrate myself into her family, to take advantage of her sons. And that to me was the most hideous part of all of their testimony, was that statement, that I was presented in as being subhuman in that way. And I don't know what she's thinking. I don't know how she justifies it. I know that money talks, and money spoke very loudly in this case. I didn't realize this until the very end of the trial, but she wept one day on the stand, recounting how she and her sons had come to trust me and how she was oblivious to all of this that was happening. And then one day, on that day after she testified, there was a short break, and a lawyer walked up to me in the men's room, outside in the lobby. I was still a free man then. He said, "You know, there's something really strange going on here." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You know, she testifies in this court, in front of this judge all the time. She's always cool, calm, collected, succinct, and precise, no matter how horrible or horrific what she's saying." And it dawned on me, she and this judge know each other. She has testified in his court as a state's witness on numerous sexual assault cases as the representative of Child Protective Services. And now here she is in his presence as the victim. How can this be? And then it also turns out that I'm not the first person her son, the one at trial, Thomas, accused. He also accused her husband of sexual abuse. His these brothers were all adopted, his adopted father. I understand at some point he recanted it after accusing me, but we were never made aware of that. This was news to me. It turned out that in a treatment program for his drug addiction, he claimed on the witness stand that he told his therapist that I sexually abused him. The therapist, who could not really direct herself to this during the trial because of confidentiality issues, has since ascertained that he did not accuse me, that the person he accused was his own adopted father. And that the only time he ever used my name was in his discharge contract. He wrote my name as his choice of contact person in sobriety. There was a case involving a young man who was accusing a Boston priest. I was aware that the case was a fraud. The young man was here in this prison with me, and he approached me one day and asked me, he had been visited by his attorney. His name was Randy. He was in his 30s, early 30s, exuded charm. He was a con artist. He was in prison for being a con artist. But he showed up at my cell door one day, and he said, big smile, a smile that could sell a used car to anyone. And he said, I was just visited by my lawyer. I said, really, Randy? And he said, yes, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay, well, talk. He said, my lawyer asked me if I'm a Catholic, and I told him, well, sort of, I used to be. And he said, my lawyer asked me if I've ever had a problem with a priest. This was 2002. He said, I knew immediately where this was going. And my lawyer said, if you want to accuse a priest of something, I can put 50 grand in your account by the end of this year. $100,000 settlement, split 50-50. All I need you to do is come up with a name, a couple of details, and a place. And so Randy said, I told the lawyer, he wouldn't tell me who the lawyer was. I told the lawyer that there just happens to be a priest on my pod in prison who's here and after being accused. And the lawyer said, this is great because they have access to directories. He says, there's this big directory of Catholics and he could probably get it. So Randy wanted me to help him find the name of a priest who might have been in his childhood community 20 years earlier. Any priest, preferably someone dead, got dementia, somebody who can't really deny it. But it doesn't matter whether they deny it. So I told Randy was offering me a finder's fee. This is a win-win situation all around. And I said, well, yes, except for the poor priest who you're about to accuse. And he said, well, that's why we want a dead one. You pick a dead one and there's no harm, no foul. Well, obviously I refused this deal. And Randy got out of prison. The next thing I know, Randy's accusing a Boston priest, and he's got a settlement pending. The Globe reported this. I wrote to the Globe writer, and I wrote to the Archdiocese of Boston and said that I have evidence that this is a fraud. Neither one of them responded. The Archdiocese settled the case. Sex abuse claimants are seen as victims throughout the system from day one, and so their reputation is protected and their name is protected. So I have encouraged priests that if the accusation is in fact false, you must publicize the name of your accuser in whatever way possible, because that's the only thing that's going to stop this tidal wave, is when false accusers are exposed. That this whole scam has not been lost on prison inmates. I'm amazed sometimes at the honesty around me. This is the place where, if you really want a view of the Catholic sex abuse scandal, this is the place to go for it. Because these guys see right through it. Right through it. They see it. And I floated something one day to some prisoners who were talking to me. I said, in my estimation, about a third of these claims are false. And they all said, no, I don't agree. It's at least half, maybe more. I know these people. They said, this is a scam. I've been approached at least a dozen times from inmates who want to know if I would give them the name of a priest in their childhood community. And the deal's already made. Their lawyers have already consented to this. We'll bring it, write a letter, get a settlement, no questions are asked. This is tragic. Anyone can just pick up the phone and say, this priest touched me, and be handed $50,000. This place is filled with people like this. So they see the sex abuse scandal very differently. And they wonder when the church is going to wake up.